Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, as part of my ongoing series covering Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're talking about rings. Specifically, the rings that you get in Act 2. As you can see, the Act 1 rings that we've already covered are excellent. Some of the strongest items in the game are already filling this item slot, so the Act 2 rings are going to need to be commensurately even more powerful in order to compete with the already excellent items that we have available in this item slot. Luckily, the Act 2 rings are incredible. Some of the very strongest items in the game are in this category, and as we go through them, you're going to see that we get to fill out this already highly in-demand item slot with some truly excellent items that will keep rings as one of the most powerful items in the game. Even though each character gets 2, you will not have trouble finding 8 excellent rings to equip your characters with, so let's get into it and start talking about rings. In previous tier lists, we've already covered how we're rating the items, and you can refer to part 1 for a definition of the tiers, so let's just get started. Before I begin though, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Gibbon85 for the £5 donation, Phasing for the $10, Mike Fusion for the €5, and Now Official and Jay Skulls for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really do appreciate the support, and it really does mean a lot. Alright, let's rate some rings. Now, just in case you thought I was exaggerating about how good the Act 2 rings are, we're going to start with what I think is one of the most in-competition items in the entire game, the Callous Ring. It's a rare party setup where at least 2 or 3 characters don't want this ring, and probably all 4 will benefit from it. And so the real question for the Callous Ring is which character is going to make the best use of it. The Callous Ring has an odd tooltip. It says the wearer deals 2 additional points of damage to creatures that are illuminated, but doesn't actually expand on what that means in practice. The Callous Ring deals 2 extra points of radiant damage, so the damage that you get is specifically radiant damage, to any creature that's in a brightly lit area. So if they are in a source of light, then you deal 2 extra points of radiant damage when you deal damage to them from any source at all. This damage can happen from spells, it can happen from unarmed attacks, it can happen from weapon attacks, it can happen from AoE spells. So any time that you are dealing damage to the enemy, you're going to deal 2 extra points of damage with the Callous Ring. It being radiant damage is of course incredibly relevant because that lets you apply radiating orbs. So the character that has the highest priority on this item is going to be a radiating orb build, but any character that does lots of instances of damage is going to get plus 10 or even plus 20 damage in a round from having the Callous Ring equipped before you even optimize for using this item significantly. If you have effects that deal multiple instances of damage, like Eldritch Blast or Scorching Ray, which fire multiple beams, then each beam is going to deal an additional 2 points of damage. Magic Missile will deal 2 points of extra damage for every missile. So the Callous Ring adds additional damage in massive quantities to any character that's dealing lots of damage instances. AoE spells will deal 2 extra damage to everything they hit. Things like Spirit Guardians will deal 2 extra damage. Damage over time spells will deal the 2 extra damage at the start of the enemy's turn, and when you cast the spell, and then at the start of the turn. So, the Callous Ring just pumps out damage. It's even more ridiculous on difficulty levels below Honor mode, because on Tactician or below, the Callous Ring is a damage rider, so any damage rider source will proc it, meaning that you can deal 2 extra damage both on your unarmed attack and on the Tavern Brawler damage from your unarmed attack, and it also is itself a damage rider source, so it's then going to proc your Tavern Brawler damage a second time. So on lower difficulty settings, the Callous Ring stacks damage up to absurd amounts, but even on Honor mode, it's a ridiculous amount of extra damage. The normal use for this is with to add radiant damage to any attack so that you can stack radiating orbs with that character. A radiating orb cleric gets to stack up to 10 radiating orbs basically immediately because the Callous Ring's separate damage instance stacks all your radiating orbs again. But any character that does lots of damage instances can make excellent use of this item. All you have to do is make sure that the enemy is in a lit area, which you can do by casting light or using a weapon that has a light radius itself, so that your character glows, and the Callous Glow Ring will be ridiculous. S tier, obviously, but the number of uses for this item are absurd, and every party can make excellent use of it. Next up, the Coruscation Ring. The Coruscation Ring adds 2 turns of Radiating Orb whenever you deal spell damage to an enemy while you, the caster, are lit by a light source. You'll notice some synergy with the Callous Glow Ring. They both want you to do the same thing. However, unlike the Callous Glow Ring, the Coruscation Ring is bugged and doesn't actually care if you're lit by a light source at all. So it just adds 2 turns of Radiating Orb whenever you deal spell damage. The spell damage can be from a spell you cast or from a scroll. It just has to be spell damage, and it does 2 turns of Radiating Orb. Again, you get multiple stacks of it if you use spells that deal multiple damage instances. The Coruscation Ring is a core component of Radiating Orb builds, especially with Spirit Guardians, because then you are just dealing additional stacks of Radiating Orb every time your Spirit Guardians tick, but any character that's dealing spell damage can make use of this. Radiating Orb builds are some of the most powerful in Baldur's Gate 3. Stacking up a -10 penalty to your enemy's attacks means that you will be basically immune to taking damage from physical attacks, and you can do that very quickly if you are properly geared for it with the Coruscation Ring, the Luminous Armour, and other sources of Radiating Orb. For Radiating Orb builds, this is the normal setup, is the Callous Glow Ring plus the Coruscation Ring, but it's also worth noting that any spellcaster can make use of this if you're dealing spell damage. The Coruscation Ring is just a good rider to have on any spell damage. Like, if you throw a fireball and it also gives everybody an unsavable -2 penalty to attacks, even if you aren't comboing this with a ton of other sources of Radiating Orb, that's just good. -2 penalty to attacks on top of the damaging spells that you were already doing is just a very powerful effect in and of itself. And so the Coruscation Ring is good even for characters that aren't specifically spec'd into Radiating Orb, but obviously incredible for characters that are. S tier, one of the items that is most prevalent in one of the most powerful builds in Baldur's Gate 3, and so obviously is going to take a front seat in terms of itemization, but also just good for a wide array of other characters. And the hits don't stop coming there. The Eversight Ring gives you blind immunity. This sounds kind of unassuming and like it's not going to be a particularly powerful item, because there's not that many enemies in the game that blind you, though having immunity to that effect is pretty nice. The real key to the Eversight Ring is that it makes you immune to your own effects that blind you, including Fog Cloud and Darkness. So a character who doesn't have Warlock levels can stand inside their own clouds of darkness without being blinded, so without taking the disadvantage, and be immune to ranged attacks from enemies, and able to shoot freely out of the darkness cloud. Because of how it interacts, it actually also makes you able to freely shoot into darkness clouds. Most characters normally can't target creatures that are inside darkness clouds, but if you're immune to blind, you actually completely ignore that effect. So you can target ranged attacks into darkness clouds when you have the Eversight Ring equipped. You can also stand inside your own clouds of darkness to gain ranged attack immunity, give melee enemies disadvantage on their attacks because of the blinding, and freely fire out of it. So it lets non-Warlock characters make use of Darkness the same way that Warlocks do, which obviously is very powerful. Darkness is one of the best and most powerful spells in the game, one of the most powerful strategies in the game, and being able to extend it to a wider array of characters opens up a lot of party compositions, and they're very powerful. The Eversight Ring's also kind of interesting from a metagame reason. It's one of the few items that you cannot spawn into the game using third-party tools. The console won't let you spawn this item. You get a bugged version of the item with no magical effect instead. So if you are like me and doing build guides, you have to actually pick up the item rather than spawn it in with the console. And I don't know why that is for only a couple items in the game, but that's just a kind of neat factoid about it. But in-game, the Eversight Ring is a core component of any party that is intending to use Clouds of Darkness or Fog Cloud in order to blind enemies without being blinded themselves. For that reason, it's not for every party. Not every party is going to make use of it, but the parties that do, it's going to be an absolutely core component of those parties. I'm going to put it in A tier, because there are lots of compositions where this isn't an incredibly powerful effect, but if you have a warlock in your party, or if you are planning to build around darkness, then the Eversight Ring is mandatory. So this is a slightly odd A tier because it really depends on your party composition, and for the characters that want it, you really, really want it. The Family Ring. The Family Ring gives you a +2 bonus to your death saving throws. So if your character is at 0 hit points and rolling death saves, normally you need an 11 or higher to stabilize. With the Family Ring, you only need a 9 or higher. Not only are there lots of ways to auto-stabilize, you really shouldn't be in the position where you're rolling death saving throws, and if you do die in Baldur's Gate 3, Revivify is very cheap. Getting resurrected is extremely cheap, so there's no reason to ever equip the Family Ring. It's just there as a flavor item. By this point in the game, Gale can't eat it anymore, but you can give your best shot to having him do so anyways, because you certainly don't need this item for its effect. D tier. Firzu's Ring of Trading. The Firzu's Ring of Trading gives you +1 to your deception checks. This is an interesting one because it's +1 to your deception skill. So like some of the items that increase your stealth, this actually gives you +2 to deception if you have expertise in deception, because it increases your proficiency bonus to deception by 1, rather than giving you a +1 bonus to your deception. That's basically the only interesting thing about this item. Obviously, it's a way to boost your deception, so if you know you have an important deception check coming up, you can swap it in, or you can swap it in before you go into conversation. The +1 bonus, honestly, isn't really worth the effort, in my opinion, of keeping this ring around, but if you want to strictly optimize, you can. C tier, because it's a very minor bonus that you can easily forget about without any penalty. And just to clown on Firzu's Ring of Trading a little bit, the Ring of Geniality is available in the same act and gives you +1 to Persuasion and Deception. Now this one gives you actual bonuses to your skills, so it's not doubled by expertise. They've just coded these items differently. But the Ring of Geniality obviously is better. Persuasion's a more relevant skill, and the +1 bonus to both of them is better than the +1 bonus to one of them. So the Ring of Geniality is more likely to be used. Since there are some pretty important persuasion checks in Act 2, the Ring of Geniality is worth hanging on to swap in if you want to avoid some of the Act 2 bosses. For that reason, I am going to give it B tier, just because persuasion is such a powerful skill in the act in which you get it. But this is a slightly begrudging B tier, because it's still a very minor bonus. The Killer's Sweetheart. You may notice that some of the items jumped around here. I realized I hadn't alphabetized the tier list properly, so we've fixed that now, hopefully. The Killer's Sweetheart. Whenever you kill a creature, your next attack roll will be a critical hit. You don't get to control which attack is a critical hit very well in this case. It's just your next attack roll after you kill a creature will always critically hit. And it only works on weapon attacks. It doesn't work on unarmed attacks or spell attacks, so you have to be attacking with a weapon in order to make use of this effect. Nevertheless, guaranteed criticals are incredibly powerful for a wide array of builds in Baldur's Gate, and of course you do get some control over when this effect triggers, because you can leave enemies at low health to deliberately take them out with one of your attacks and then make your second attack with the Killer's Sweetheart guaranteed critical alongside, say, a sneak attack or smite attack in order to double the damage of a very powerful attack with the guaranteed critical hit. The Killer's Sweetheart has a long rest cooldown, so it only works once per long rest, but even one critical hit per long rest is still very powerful for builds that make use of critical hits very well. If you have this guaranteed critical up, you can use a smite, you can use a sneak attack, you can use one of your smite spells, for example, in order to get a ton of additional damage, and so you can make use of the Killer's Sweetheart alongside characters that just want to do lots of critical hits to guarantee that even more. You can only use this in one encounter per day, so it's probably one that you want to swap off after you've made use of the effect, but the effect is extremely strong. Critical hits obviously are very good, and killing enemies is something that critical hit builds plan to do already, so it's very easy to trigger the condition that makes this go off. and then very powerful to use once you have this condition, so the Killer Sweetheart is going to be very good for any build that does a lot of damage using a lot of dice. A tier because it's only effective in one encounter per day, so you'll probably want to take it off after you've used it, but the effect is so strong that it's very much worth using in that one encounter per day to kill enemies that much quicker. The Poisoner's Ring. The Poisoner's Ring allows you to, as an action, make an enemy make a con save or become vulnerable to poison for 10 rounds. Now, the tooltip for this item is misleading, words that you've heard me say a few times, because it says make an enemy, but this actually lets you target up to 3 creatures with this action. And it doesn't mention that there's a saving throw for this, but there is a DC 14 con save associated with this. So, DC 14 con save is relatively easy to pass. A lot of enemies will be able to succeed on it, but since you can target up to 3 creatures, it's likely that at least one of them will fail the saving throw, even though it's a relatively easy save. And of course, most enemies that are vulnerable to poison, or can be hurt by poison damage, and therefore it's good to make them vulnerable to poison, are also able to be afflicted with bleeding, which can give them disadvantage on the saving throw and make it more likely that this succeeds. Poison damage is not a mainstay strategy, it's not a mainstay strategy for most parties, but if you have a character that's doing a lot of poison damage, vulnerability is always worth looking at. Doubling damage is incredibly powerful, and vulnerability is something that Baldur's Gate is a little less careful with than D&D in general, and D&D in general is very careful with vulnerability because it's such an incredibly potent effect. It breaks the normal difficulty curve of combats by making enemies effectively have half the hit points they would otherwise, so you kill them in half the turns. The Poisoner's Ring taking a full action means it's kind of hard to actually use in combat. So the main use of this item is if you have a character who's casting Cloud Kill, which does a ton of poison damage. This can double the poison damage. Cloud Kill does 5d8 poison damage, but it does it both when you cast it and at the start of the turn of the character who's in it, so it's effectively 10d8 poison damage. If they're then vulnerable to that damage, that's 20d8 damage. If you make 3 enemies vulnerable to poison damage and then hit them with Cloud Kill, you've effectively spent your action to deal 30d8 damage, which is an amazing use of an action. So the Poisoner's Ring is actually very good if you have Cloud Kill. You want to equip this on a different character than the one actually casting Cloud Kill, or use Potions of Speed or Haste in order to both activate the Poisoner's Ring and cast Cloud Kill in the same turn. But if you're using Cloud Kill or have other sources of large amounts of poison damage, the Poisoner's Ring is actually pretty good, because vulnerability, even weak conditional vulnerability, is just that powerful a mechanic. Also notable with the Poisoner's Ring, it doesn't start combat to use this, so if you use it on a neutral character, you can make them vulnerable to poison before you then cast Cloud Kill to pop them immediately. So it has some cool uses, and that's also very flavorful for a Poisoner's Ring, to activate on characters that aren't yet hostile and not have to spend the action on it. B tier for the Poisoner's Ring, because it's a very powerful effect that only some parties are going to be able to make use of, but this is actually one that is worth building around. The Poisoner's Ring plus Cloud Kill is a very powerful combination that will just win an encounter by itself if you can make enemies fail the saving throw, and since it doesn't require doesn't start combat, it's often risk-free to do this if you're starting a combat with neutral enemies. The Ring of Exalted Marrow. The Ring of Exalted Marrow, first off, has an awesome name. Exalted Marrow is just very fun to say, and sadly that is, I think, the coolest thing about this item. It gives you 2 unique spells, each castable once per long rest. The first of these is a melee range paralysis, so it paralyzes an enemy for 2 turns, which is pretty good for an action, except that it has an unimprovable, you can't raise the save DC in any way, DC 13 con save, and the enemy just ignores it if they pass that save. DC 13 is just too low for an item at this point. It's not what I want to spend an action on in order to make an enemy make a save like that, even with disadvantage from bleeding, or if you've somehow stacked save penalties on the enemy, then it's still not going to be amazing. The main use for this is if you have like a divination wizard with a low roll stocked up, you can maybe guarantee they fail the save, and then that could be okay. But for the most part, you'd rather just cast a spell at that point and take them out of the fight that way. So only like if you had a divination wizard but were completely out of debilitating spell slots for the day, would the Ring of Exalted Marrow be useful? And that's such a narrow circumstance, I don't think it's going to come up. The other spell is a command. It's exactly the same as the spell command, but you can only cast it on undead. And then they will have to make a wisdom save, otherwise they take one of the effects of command, most notably falling prone and skipping their turn. And again, I just don't think it's worth it to equip a ring for this, like, level 1 spell effect at this point in the game. So, D tier for the Ring of Exalted Marrow. Awesome name, sadly, pretty mediocre effect. The Ring of Free Action. The Ring of Free Action basically gives you freedom of movement all of the time. It makes you immune to the slowing effects of difficult terrain, and you can't be paralyzed or restrained. There's a couple other effects that it makes you immune to, because it basically works the same as freedom of movement, so most things that restrict your movement, it will prevent. The Freedom of Movement spell is a spell I actually like quite a bit, but not for the effect of the spell. It's because it breaks you out of stuns, and that can be pretty useful as a panic button in an emergency. The effect of the spell, I think, is relatively weak. Immunity to paralysis is definitely nice, because there are some dangerous enemies that paralyze you. It's the most dangerous effect in the game. So if it's the most dangerous condition in the game, so being immune to it does prevent some ways of losing combats. But is it worth an entire gear slot? I think mostly no. The immunity to difficult terrain sounds interesting, but unfortunately the freedom of movement version of this doesn't make you immune to the damage from spike growth. So mainly the use for this would be to move around your own plant growths with impunity, and if you have a heavily difficult terrain-themed party, the Ring of Free Action could maybe help one of your characters that doesn't naturally get difficult terrain immunity to move around in plant growth, and you could maybe swap it in for some encounters where you know enemies are going to cast Hold Person or try to paralyze you in some way. I'll give it C tier because I think it does have some minor uses, but this is not one that's going to come up for most parties most of the time. The Ring of Mental Inhibition. The Ring of Mental Inhibition gives enemies 2 turns of mental fatigue every time they fail a saving throw against something that your character does, one of your spells or actions. Mental fatigue reduces their intelligence, wisdom, and charisma saving throws by 1 per stack remaining, so with just 1 failed save against one of your spells with this item, they get -2 penalty to all of their mental saves, up to a maximum of a -7 penalty. If they then fail one of those saves while they have a -5 or more penalty, they take a little damage and the effect goes away, but at that point you've hit them with a debilitating wisdom saving throw effect, so you have probably taken them out of the fight anyways, and the item, or the mental fatigue, will have done its job. The Ring of Mental Inhibition actually sounds pretty interesting on a character that makes enemies make a lot of saving throws, because you could use this alongside an effect that makes them make saves a lot to stack up mental fatigue, then hit them with like a hypnotic pattern to take them out of the fight pretty easily with a big penalty to their saving throw. And that is something that you can do. Unfortunately, the Ring of Mental Inhibition doesn't work with a lot of the types of effects that make enemies make saving throws a lot. This item was kind of a problem in early patches of Baldur's Gate 3. It was very unbalanced, and so they kind of hotfixed it in a slightly hacky way. It no longer works with weapon passives, weapon coatings, wall spells, or cloud spells. So they don't get the effect if they stand in one of your walls of fire. They don't get the effect if you hit them with Cloud Kill. They don't get the effect if you hit them while you have the Helldusk gloves equipped to make them save against bleeding. So it's actually pretty hard to stack up mental fatigue to high values with this item, because you have to actually use a spell or action that makes them make a saving throw in order to get this effect. It's still pretty good on something like, let's say, a monk. With Stunning Strike, you can stun them for 1 turn, knock them over with a Flurry of Blows from an open hand monk, That's 2 saves, that's a -4 penalty on all their wisdom saves, and that's enough to land a hold person or something like that. And so it can work on that type of character. In general, this is basically a more awkward way to achieve the same thing that Arcane Acuity achieves, and you're better off using Arcane Acuity with most characters. But penalties to enemy saving throws are pretty powerful regardless, so even though this is somewhat awkward and doesn't work with every effect that it probably should work with, it's still a pretty powerful tool. The Ring of Mental Inhibition can make it really easy to land a debilitating saving throw effect, and that can win combats. So while you do have to pretty carefully construct your party around this item, if you do so, it's pretty powerful. I'm going to give it B tier because it does require very specific builds and won't work for a lot of types of characters, but the characters it does work with, it's quite good. The Ring of Self-Immolation. The Ring of Self-Immolation lets you, as a bonus action, once per short rest, set yourself on fire and gain 2 turns of heat. You take 1d4 fire damage every turn while you have heat, and then when you deal fire damage, you expend all of your stacks of heat in order to deal that much more fire damage. The main use for this item is to stack up to the maximum of 7 turns of heat, and then cast Fireball to deal an extra 7 damage to everything you hit with the Fireball. And that can be a reasonably powerful a reasonably powerful strategy. Because that can be a bunch of additional damage. This has to be used with other sources of heat in order to be effective, because 2 extra damage in exchange on a fireball in exchange for your bonus action isn't a great trade. Obviously, that's just dominated by the Callous Ring, which does 2 extra damage all the time. And a bonus action can usually be more valuable than that, but with other sources of heat, the Ring of Self-Immolation can be okay. I think this is one that's probably more work to jump through the hoops than it's worth, so I'm going to give it C tier, but for a character built specifically to use this effect, you could get a little bit of additional value out of it. The Ring of Shadows. The Ring of Shadows lets you cast Pass Without Trace once per long rest for a +10 bonus to your stealth checks. Pass Without Trace is a level 2 spell, so it basically saves you a level 2 spell slot. Bonuses to your stealth checks mostly don't matter in Baldur's Gate, except if you're doing greater invisibility stuff, in which case Pass Without Trace is basically mandatory, because then the greater invisibility lasts for longer. How greater invis works is when you make an attack, you have to pass a stealth check. You start at a DC 15 stealth check, and then your second attack, it's a DC 17, and then it's 18, 19, 20, 21. Don't ask me why it skipped 16, I don't know. But basically, the higher your stealth checks, the more attacks you can make while invisible without enemies reacting. Making attacks while invisible without enemies reacting is, of course, incredible, and this just lets you do that more often. Pass Without Trace is kind of mandatory for those builds, so the Ring of Shadows is mandatory for that kind of build. It's useful only for a very, very narrow strategy, which is the greater invisibility stealth archery strategy, but for the Ring of Shadows, it's a nice boost to that character. Still not an incredible boost, because you can get Pass Without Trace from other sources, but for those characters, it's good. B tier, because it basically saves you a spell slot when you're doing that single particular strategy. The Ring of Spiteful Thunder. The Ring of Spiteful Thunder lets you force enemies to make a saving throw or become dazed if they take thunder damage while they have stacks of reverberation on them. So if you deal thunder damage to a reverberating enemy, they have to make a DC 13 con save or they become dazed. Reverberating reduces their con save, so they're likely to fail that even though it's a relatively low saving throw. And it's sort of passive, and reverberation builds already want to be doing thunder damage, because that's one of the ways to apply reverberation, is to do thunder damage. So this is basically just a lot of free value for a reverberation build. Dazed is not the most devastating condition, but it's pretty good. Gives them disadvantage on wisdom saves and makes them unable to take reactions, so you can freely move around without them making attacks of opportunity. And they can't counterspell or use a lot of various honor mode legendary actions. So the Ring of Spiteful Thunder is pretty nice for that. A lot of enemies will resist the effect even with the saving throw penalty from reverberation, but it's also basically free, and anything that stacks a condition for free is always worth looking at, especially because this is a condition, and putting conditions on people is one of the ways to apply Reverberation and Radiating Orb, so it's going to apply even more of those. It just all stacks together if you're doing that kind of effect. For a Radiating Orb focus build, the Callous Glow and Coruscation Ring are the normal ones, but the Ring of Spiteful Thunder makes an interesting alternative if you're doing both Radiating Orb and Reverberation, and if you're a pure Reverberation build, it's pretty good. So overall, the Ring of Spiteful Thunder is an A-tier item. It's just very solid for Reverberation builds that are based on thunder damage. The effect is minor, but passive, and passive effects that are available all the time are still just always great. The Ring of Twilight. The Ring of Twilight gives you +1 to your armor class while you're obscured. So if you're in an area of shadow, then the Ring of Twilight gives you a +1 to your AC. Obviously, this is significantly worse than the Ring of Protection, which just always gives you a +1 to your AC and +1 to your saves. But I think slightly better at this point in the game than the Bracing Band. It's a little easier to trigger being obscured than pushing an enemy, unless, of course, you're a Warlock with Repelling Blast, who should be getting the Bracing Band triggered basically all of the time. The Ring of Twilight, I think, is a very situational item. In another item slot, this might be worth it, but +1 AC conditionally in Act 2 just doesn't cut it for a ring for me, because rings are such a powerful and competitive item slot that +1 armor class at this point in the game, only some of the time, isn't particularly good. There is a bug with the Ring of Twilight that you can abuse, where if you put it on while in shadow and then enter Wild Shape, you keep the +1 armor class, whether or not you remain in shadow, and even though items aren't supposed to work in Wild Shape. So you can abuse this with a druid, but it is a bug, which I also haven't tested recently, so that may have been fixed. But the Ring of Twilight was a way to get an additional AC on a druid Wild Shape for a while. I think, ignoring the bug, I'm going to give this item a C tier. In another item slot, it might be a B tier, because +1 armor class would be, conditional +1 armor class would be fine in another item slot. But for a ring, that just doesn't cut it at this point in the game for me. In Act 2, we can do way better with our ring slots, because rings are so good, so C tier. The Risky Ring. The Risky Ring, the favorite item of Reddit character optimizers, gives you advantage on all of your attack rolls and disadvantage on all of your saving throws. Advantage on all attack rolls all the time obviously is incredibly powerful. I don't need to say how good that is. Now, you can often achieve advantage through other means. By this point in the game, there's other items that let you get advantage pretty easily. You can hide before combat starts, but permanent passive advantage is incredibly powerful. It means you miss your attacks much less often, and you critically hit much more often, especially if you're a build that has additional critical hit chance built into it. Disadvantage on your saving throws is a real downside. A lot of people ignore this part of this item, but disadvantage on your saving throws is a definite downside. Enemies will target you with the disadvantage in mind, so a character wearing the Risky Ring is much more likely to get targeted by saving throw targeting effects. And if you get hit by a hold person or something, it doesn't matter that you have advantage on your attack rolls, because you can't do anything. You can offset this by gaining advantage on your saving throws to offset the disadvantage on saves, or by not getting targeted, or by enemies just being dead before combat starts. The disadvantage of this item is real. I don't want to downplay that, but the advantage of this item, no pun intended, is absurd. And so tons of builds will still be able to make amazing use of the Risky Ring, because advantage on all of your attacks, if you don't have other easy sources of it, this just gets you that all the time for free, and so that's going to be incredibly awesome. I think this item can be a little dangerous for inexperienced players, because you do have to position your characters where they won't get targeted, or take out enemies who have saving throw targeting effects before they can cripple your character with the Risky Ring equipped, but the upsides of this item are some of the very highest in the game, and so it's definitely one that you should use on builds that want it, absolutely. Make sure that you offset the downside in some way, either by killing enemies before they take a turn, or by giving yourself advantage on saves, but the Risky Ring is too good to leave at home. S tier. The Shadowblade Ring. The Shadowblade Ring lets you, as a bonus action, summon a Shadowblade, an item that's a short sword, but instead of the normal short sword damage, it does 2d8 psychic damage instead of the base 1d6 that normal short swords do. It has no weapon enhancement bonus, so no bonus chance to hit, or no bonus damage in addition to the 2d8 psychic damage, so it will probably have a slightly lower hit chance than other short swords or daggers, but much higher base damage to offset that. It lets you add your strength or dex modifier as normal, and that modifier also gets added as psychic damage, and any other additional damage that you do might be psychic damage as well when you're using the Shadowblade Ring. I will say, I love this item, and I want to make it work more than it probably deserves. The Shadowblade Ring's lower chance to hit than other weapons is a real downside, and it goes away if you lose concentration. Maintaining the Shadowblade requires concentration, and losing your weapon in the middle of combat because you take a hit is definitely a real problem. Supposedly, it's the item is supposed to give you advantage on attack rolls against obscured targets, which would offset the downsides of not having an enhancement bonus by giving you a bonus chance to hit. Unfortunately, that's bugged and just doesn't do anything. You will never see the advantage on obscured targets when you're using this item. So it just has a slightly lower hit chance than an equivalent enchanted dagger would at this stage in the game. 2d8 psychic damage is pretty good. A lot of enemies do resist psychic damage, so it won't work against enemies that do. But you can also use the Resonance Stone in the late game in order to give enemies vulnerability to psychic damage, which of course powers up this item significantly. The Shadowblade is super cool, and you can definitely make builds around it. For a character that's not structured around giving enemies vulnerability to psychic damage, it's mostly going to be worse than a normal short sword, because losing concentration and losing your weapon is such a huge downside. But this item is awesome, and I love trying to make it work. And there's definitely some builds that can make use of it a little bit better than others if you are able to maintain concentration easily, like by having a paladin aura, by having con save proficiency, and so on. I'm going to say B tier for the Shadowblade Ring. If you build around psychic damage vulnerability specifically, it can be pretty good. But for most characters, this is going to be a little bit too hard to gain the bonuses of. Just because you'll end up missing your attacks a little bit too much when you use this item. But it is an item that I personally love and try to use all the time. The Shadow-Cloaked Ring. The Shadow-Cloaked Ring makes your weapons and unarmed strikes deal an extra d4 damage to enemies that are obscured in shadow. If they're lightly or heavily obscured, they take an extra d4 of damage. This is actually one of the few rings that works on unarmed attacks. A lot of the other damage bonus rings only work with weapons, so it's cool for a monk who's making unarmed attacks. And the fact that it adds an extra d4 of damage instead of flat damage, like the Caustic Band or the Callous Glow Ring, is a pretty big advantage, because adding extra damage dice is really good, since they can then be multiplied by critical hits. The only real downside of the Shadow-Cloaked Ring, whose condition is relatively easy to fulfill otherwise, is that you can't use it and the Callous Glow Ring at the same time. Callous Glow requires your enemy to be lit, Shadow-Cloaked requires them to be obscured, so it's hard to use both of them in the same party. But this is still an insanely powerful effect. An extra d4 damage on all of your weapon attacks or all of your unarmed strikes is awesome. The fact that it multiplies with critical hits is just a bonus on top of that, but it's a huge amount of additional damage. And so any character that's going to be operating in darkened or unlit areas can use the Shadow-Cloaked Ring to incredible effect. Bonus damage, it's still always just one of the very best things that you can do in Baldur's Gate 3, and the Shadow-Cloaked Ring is no exception. S tier for any character that's operating in shadows, especially things like Shadow Monks or Rogues. The Shifting Corpus Ring. The Shifting Corpus Ring lets you cast Invisibility once per long rest and Blur once per long rest. Both of those are pretty useful spells, especially when you get them for free, so the Shifting Corpus Ring is pretty reasonable. You can use it for invisibility if you need an extra cast of invisibility to save yourself a potion or a scroll, and you can use it on Blur, which is a decent defensive spell if you happen to want a cast of Blur. Mostly this is just save a level 2 spell slot on invisibility once per day, but there are some days where that extra level 2 spell slot comes in handy and you want a cast of invisibility, and the Shifting Corpus Ring is there for you. B tier, as with a lot of the items that save you spell slots, this will be useful if you hang on to it, but obviously not a game-breaking downside if you don't pick this one up. The Snowburst Ring. The Snowburst Ring creates a 15-foot ice surface under the target whenever the wearer deals cold damage. This works off of any source of cold damage, so if you are a monk with the gloves that let you deal cold damage, then every unarmed attack is going to create an ice surface. If you have a cold damage weapon, like the Cold Snap Dagger, every attack with that weapon, ice surface. If you have cold on your arrows, if you're firing an ice arrow, then, yep, every attack, ice surface. It also works on any time you deal cold damage reactively or with a spell. So if an enemy hits you while you have Armour of Agathis on, they take cold damage, and that creates an ice surface. The 15-foot radius on this is pretty good because it can hit multiple enemies, but it does mean you have to be careful, because if you use this in melee, it's a big enough ice surface that it will be under your own character as well, which can cause them to fall over. So you need to use this alongside immunity to prone if you plan to use it in melee. There's a couple cool combos for the Snowburst Ring. Things like Arrows of Many Targets combined with cold damage can create ice under every enemy. Hunter's Volley with cold damage creates ice under a whole big group of enemies. Armour of Agathis on an Abjuration Wizard, cold damage on a bunch of enemies. You get the idea. Anytime you're dealing a lot of cold damage, especially to multiple targets, you can create ice under all of them. Ice surfaces in Baldur's Gate 3 are, of course, incredibly powerful. Prone is a very good effect. Enemies have to make a dex save or fall prone when they're on an ice surface, and if they fall prone on their turn, they lose the rest of their turn, which can cost them actions, which makes putting ice under enemies oftentimes better than a stun, because they're proned and then lose the rest of their action. Enemies will usually try to move before they take an action, so then they'll fall prone, and then they don't get their action, and you get to beat them up with advantage because they're on the ground. The Snowburst Ring lets you do one of the strongest things in Baldur's Gate, put ice under enemies, for free, and so for any character that's dealing a decent amount of cold damage, the Snowburst Ring is awesome. Whether you be a wizard or sorcerer who's cold-themed, or a character that's built around doing cold damage, or just an archer who's got a cold damage weapon, the Snowburst Ring is going to be excellent. And for melee characters, as long as you have some way to become immune to ice surfaces or falling prone, the Snowburst Ring is incredible. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's not much more to say than ice surfaces are great. This gives them to you for free. S tier for the Snowburst Ring. If you're dealing cold damage, this is going to be best in slot for that character. And finally, for Act 2 rings, the last two we're considering as a set, because they are a set, neither does anything without the other. The True Love's Caress and the True Love's Embrace let you cast Warding Bond. The wearer of the Embrace can cast Warding Bond, targeting the wearer of the Caress. I think I have that in the right order. That means that half the damage the wearer of the Caress would take will be transferred to the wearer of the Embrace. Warding Bond is a level 3 cleric spell, so the main use of these items is that you get a level 3 spell slot, and you can cast it from a character who's not a cleric. So you can have a character who you more want to have taking half the damage from another party member, like, for example, a barbarian who has lots of hit points to soak that damage with. And so this lets you basically make use of a powerful cleric spell on another character who might even be better with that spell. A couple synergistic options here, of course, are having a barbarian cast it, casting it on an Abjuration Wizard, because the damage is calculated after damage reductions. An Abjuration Wizard will reduce the damage to 0, so giving them resistance to all damage means that no damage will end up being transferred to the caster. So there's a couple cool things you can do with this even within your party. And of course you can use this as a camp caster in order to transfer half of the damage from one of your active characters to a character back at your camp, though I personally think that's a little bit abusive. your mileage may vary as to whether that's a strategy that you want to use in the actual game. Warding Bond is an incredibly powerful effect in Baldur's Gate. It basically, any ambiguity that the spell has in tabletop, which it has a few, they've ruled in favor of Warding Bond in Baldur's Gate. It stacks with other sources of resistance to deal 1/4 damage, which I'm not sure it should, but it does. It works with damage reduction very positively for you because it reduces it basically reduces on the front end and on the back end if either character has damage reduction. So you can gain a lot of benefit from Warding Bond. Now, is this worth 2 item slots in your active party? I tend not to think so. Warding Bond is a very good spell, but spending 2 of your 8 ring slots on basically a level 3 spell slot, I don't think is a super powerful effect. So, and even spending 1 ring slot on Warding Bond for a camp caster to cast it is obviously very good. It's kind of just free resistance to all damage. But even then, that's still a real cost, because rings are just so powerful. I think if you're using these with a camp caster, then they're very good, because basically you're spending a ring on resistance to all damage. If you're not using them with a camp caster, they're still usable. I'm going to be assuming that you're using them both in your active party, because that's the way the game is sort of intending. But just bear in mind that there is the extra use case. For a party that uses both of them in the active party, I think they are B tier. They have some pretty cool synergy for characters that specifically synergize with Warding Bond, and they let you do it on a character that normally couldn't, and that's kind of fun. But it does have a real opportunity cost of costing 2 of your ring slots. Alright, my friends, I hope that you have enjoyed this look at the Act 2 rings. Again, one of the most powerful sets of items in the game. You can see that Act 1 rings started off strong, and Act 2 rings continue even stronger. So hopefully this will help you make use of one of the very best item slots in the game. And this includes this tier list includes some of the most used items in the game, like the Callous Glow Ring and the Risky Ring, which just show up in like every party probably, if you're trying to optimize. So definitely should give you some ideas of which items to bring and which to leave at home. As always, of course, if you think that I should move something around, definitely let me know in the comments. I'm always very open to feedback on these tier lists, and we've definitely moved items in the past if I have placed them in the wrong tier. So if you have a good argument as to why I should move it, definitely let me know. And of course, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment of any kind and hit like, because YouTube loves it when people interact with the video, and I appreciate you taking the time to help boost the algorithm for me. As always, of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 guides and other strategy game analysis, and I will catch you next time. Thanks for watching, my friends.